There's other situations that it been dice games, like Toney Yayo was at a dice game. He was rolling dice with somebody. Shit went left. He got smacked. Guns came out. It was a Wild Wild West situation.
There's other situations where dice games have turned into straight chaos, just like this one with Toney Yayo. He was at a dice game rolling dice with somebody, minding his business in what should have been a regular hood moment, but things went left quick. He got smacked, stunts came out, guns were drawn, and it turned into a full-blown Wild West situation right in the middle of New York City. Oh my God. Can you imagine that level of madness popping off on a random corner or in some backroom spot? And here's the craziest part. The person who spilled this on camera, he grew up with Toney Yayo. He knows him personally from way back. This ain't some random dude trying to run his mouth for clout or attention. This is someone who was actually there in the mix, breathing the same air, seeing the same streets, and living that same grind. But before we dive deep into all of that wildness and break down every layer of what went down, let me break down everything you need to know about who Toney Yayo really is, where he came from, and why this story hits so different when you really understand the streets he was raised on. Stay locked in because this one is gonna go crazy from start to finish, no cap, with twists that make you rethink everything you thought you knew about G-Unit loyalty, street credibility, and how the block never really lets you go even when the fame hits. All right, gang, let me break it down for you because a lot of people know the name Toney Yayo, but a lot of y'all don't actually know the full story behind the man. And I'm not even lying. The story of where this man came from is wild enough on its own, before we even get to the dice game situation that everybody's talking about right now. So Toney Yayo, real name Marvin Bernard, was born on March 31st, 1978, in South Jamaica, Queens, New York City. And when I say South Jamaica, Queens, I need y'all to really understand what that meant in the late 1980s and early 1990s, because that neighborhood was not for the faint of heart at all. We're talking one of the most notoriously tough pockets in all of New York, where the streets raised you whether you wanted them to or not, and survival was the only curriculum that mattered. Poverty was everywhere you looked, hanging over the blocks like a constant shadow, with families scraping by in cramped apartments, while the drug trade boomed right outside the front door, like it was the only real job market in town. Violence was something you saw growing up, before you even fully understood what it was. Fistfights turning into shootouts, corner boys holding down spots with iron in their waistbands, and the crack epidemic turning whole blocks into war zones where loyalty was tested daily, and snitches got dealt with in the harshest ways. South Jamaica back then wasn't just a zip code. It was a pressure cooker of hustle, pain, and raw ambition. The kind of place that forged legends or broke souls. And Yayo grew up right in the middle of all of that intensity, soaking it in whether he liked it or not. The crack wars of the 80s had turned the area into a battlefield, with rival crews fighting over turf, police raids happening like clockwork, and young kids learning early that the boulevard wasn't a playground. It was a proving ground, where one wrong move could end everything. But even in that chaos, there were families trying to hold it together. And Yayo's parents were Haitian immigrants, hard-working people who came to America looking for something better, chasing that dream against all the odds stacked against them in a city that didn't always welcome newcomers with open arms. His mother was a nurse's aide who eventually became a registered nurse, a real one putting in work day and night, trying to hold the family together through shifts that never seemed to end while the streets pulled at her son like a magnet. And Yayo has talked about this in interviews, reflecting on how he had a good upbringing at home despite everything. His mother was solid as a rock, providing structure and love in a world that offered neither. And his father was in the picture early on, trying to steer him right even as the block called louder. But y'all already know how this goes. The block don't care about what's happening inside your house, no matter how strong the family foundation is. The outside world had its own rules, its own pull, and it didn't respect curfews or parental warnings. And here's something that really stuck with me from what Yayo shared years back in those candid conversations. He said his father used to always tell him, stay off the boulevard, drilling it into his head like a mantra because he saw the danger coming from a mile away. That's still in his head to this day, and he literally laughed about it in one interview, saying that same warning his father gave him made him want to go to the boulevard more, like forbidden fruit calling his name in the dead of night. And get this, the same boulevard his father told him to stay off of, that's the same exact boulevard he ended up getting arrested on later in life. Bro, that's actually insane when you think about it on a deeper level, because it shows how powerful those streets were, how they had a grip that no amount of good parenting could fully break if the environment was designed to swallow you whole. His father saw it coming, tried to warn him with every fiber of his being, and it still happened anyway, like fate or the hood code had other plans. That's the kind of layered reality that makes Yayo's story so compelling. Not just rags to riches, but a constant tug of war between home lessons and street survival that so many from that era lived through but few talk about with that kind of honesty. Y'all seeing this? This is where the story starts to get layers upon layers, building up like a pressure wave ready to explode. So by the time Yayo is a teenager, we're talking mid-1990s now. The streets of South Jamaica, Queens are fully claiming him in ways that shaped his whole worldview. At just 15 years old, Marvin Bernard dropped out of school in the 10th grade, walking away from the books because the block was offering a different kind of education, one that paid in cash and respect even if it came with risks that could end your life before it really started. He was already out on the block dealing drugs to help support his family, doing what so many young brothers in that position did just to keep the lights on and food on the table when the system wasn't giving anybody a fair shot. A year later, his parents split up. His father was gone from the picture, and now you got a 16-year-old kid with no father in the house, out on the block doing what the block taught him to do, because there were no other options that felt real. But this is also where something incredible was brewing in the shadows of those same cracked sidewalks and corner stores. Because out on those streets, young Marvin Bernard ran into two kids who would change the course of his entire life in hip-hop history forever. One of them went by the name Boo Boo, who the world would later come to know as 50 Cent, already moving like a boss even back then with that magnetic energy that drew people in. And the other was a kid named Christopher Lloyd, who the world would come to know as Lloyd Banks, sharp with the pen and steady in the streets. No cap, these three became inseparable, running together, hustling together, just trying to survive together in a neighborhood that swallowed people whole if you weren't careful or connected. Yayo has talked about this too, about how 50 Cent was already a legend in the hood even back then. Said 50 had something like 20 of his own people working for him at one point, operating on a completely different level even as a young man with that fearless drive. And Yayo was right there with him, learning the game, watching every move, coming up in that same cutthroat environment where trust was earned in blood and loyalty was the only currency that mattered long term. Now, and this is important because it goes directly to today's story that everybody's buzzing about. Yayo grew up around dice games like they were part of the daily rhythm of life in South Jamaica. Gambling on the block was just Tuesday, nothing exotic or special. It was what happened on corners, in barber shops, in parks and abandoned lots where money flipped hands faster than the dice themselves. It wasn't about fun, it was about ego, quick cash, respect, and the thrill of testing fate in a world where every day already felt like a gamble. Yayo has spoken about this multiple times in interviews over the years, talked about seeing dice games go south in real time. The culture of it, where one bad roll could turn brothers into enemies over nothing but pride and pocket change. And we'll come back to that in a minute because it ties everything together like a perfect storm. So get this. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Toney Yayo, 50 Cent, and Lloyd Banks had officially formed G-Unit, grinding on the mixtape circuit hard, putting out street tapes the old-fashioned way, city block by city block, borough by borough, until their names started ringing bells in every hood from Queens to Compton. They were building something real from the ground up. No shortcuts, just raw talent, street smarts, and that unbreakable bond forged in the fire of South Jamaica. And then 50 Cent does the impossible, signing this massive deal with Aftermath and Shady Records in 2002. Dr. Dre and Eminem co-signing him like the ultimate stamp of approval. The biggest deal in hip-hop at that moment. The whole world was about to know who 50 Cent was. And G-Unit was about to go global in ways nobody could have predicted. This was their moment. The payoff for all those late-night slinging tapes out of car trunks and dodging the same streets that made them. And where was Toney Yayo in that exact moment of triumph? He was in jail, locked down on New Year's Eve 2002, arrested along with 50 Cent on weapons possession charges that hit different because of his past. But here's where it got bad for Yayo specifically. During the background check, police found out he already had an outstanding warrant from a previous weapons charge. So now it wasn't just a new case. It was bail jumping piled on top of everything, turning a bad situation into a nightmare timeline. In early 2003, he got sentenced and stayed locked up all the way into 2004, missing the explosion that was happening outside those walls. Bro, think about that timeline on a real level. 50 Cent drops in the club and goes supernova in 2003, Get Rich or Die Trying sells over 800,000 copies in the first 4 days, like it was printed money. G-Unit's Beg for Mercy drops and goes platinum, the crew selling out arenas, hitting every radio station and TV screen while the world couldn't get enough. And Toney Yayo? He's watching all of this from inside, hearing the success stories through prison phones or smuggled radios. The moment he worked his whole life for slipping right through his fingers while his brothers took over the game without him. That's actually crazy to even think about, the kind of gut punch that tests real character. But here's where you see what loyalty really looks like in this cutthroat industry. 50 Cent didn't leave his boy behind, not for a second. He wore free Yayo t-shirts everywhere he went, promoted Yayo's name in every interview, made sure that even while Yayo was locked up, the world knew who he was and knew he was an essential part of G-Unit. That campaign became one of the most organic rap marketing moments of the early 2000s. People who had never heard a Toney Yayo song knew the name because of those t-shirts, the chants at shows, the constant shout-outs that kept his spot warm. Chat, Are we surprised that kind of loyalty existed? Because in this industry, that's rare, genuinely rare. The kind of ride-or-die energy that separates real crews from fake ones. And it showed the world what G-Unit was really built on. Not just music, but that unbreakable street bond. When Yayo finally got out, the energy was there waiting for him, like a loaded spring. He dropped his debut album, Thoughts of a Predicate Felon, in August 2005, and it debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200. Off the strength of the G-Unit machine, the loyalty of his crew, and the fact that the streets never forgot his name, even for a second. But here's the thing about Toney Yayo that makes today's story so interesting and layered. Even through all of this success, even through all the fame, the albums, the tours, and the G-Unit empire that was printing money, the block never fully left him. That street mentality never fully went away, lingering like a shadow even as the platinum plaques stacked up, and the world treated him like a star. He's talked about it himself in raw interviews, said that being a rapper means you never really have your peace, that the temptations are always there, pulling at you like old habits. The lifestyle is always calling. Women, money, gambling, the whole culture of it that never sleeps. And that word gambling is where this whole story starts to connect on a deeper level. Because it's not just a hobby. It's a mindset carried over from those South Jamaica days where dice weren't just toys. They were a way of life that could build you up or tear you down in seconds. Now, before we get to what Domination said on the Cam Capone show, and believe me, we are absolutely getting there with all the receipts, let me give you some context on Toney Yayo and dice games specifically. Because this is not just some random accusation coming out of nowhere. There's a whole history here that makes the claim land even heavier when you know the background. Back in January 2023, right after Takeoff tragically passed away at a dice game in Houston, Toney Yayo actually sat down and talked about his own personal history with dice games going bad. And what he described was wild. The kind of story that reminds you how thin the line is between fun and fallout in the streets. Yayo told the story of a dice game he was at inside a New York City barbershop. Him and his boys cleaning this dude out, like absolutely taking all his money in a ruthless run that left the other guy with nothing. And when the game was over and the dude had lost everything, including what Yayo described as his rent money, the guy asked for a walk. You know, that hood code where someone who just lost big asks for a portion of their money back so they won't go home completely broke and humiliated. The winner doesn't have to give it back, but sometimes they do as a gesture of respect or to keep the peace. Yayo said he refused, and when he refused, it went left fast. What happened next? Gunfire inside a barbershop in New York City, bullets flying while people ducked for cover. And Yayo was there in the middle of it, and he actually described it, and I kid you not, as a friendly shootout. A friendly shootout, bro. Only in New York could something like that even happen without turning into a full massacre. But that's the reality of those environments where respect and money mix like gasoline and fire. So y'all are now understanding this man has history with dice games turning into chaos. This is not foreign territory for Toney Yayo at all. The streets of South Jamaica, Queens prepared him for exactly this kind of environment, where one bad decision or one refused walk could escalate into life or death in the blink of an eye. That was a situation where the guns came out on the other side. But today's story, the one Domination told, that's a completely different situation because it hits way harder for a very specific reason. It's about Yayo himself being on the receiving end, and that changes the whole narrative when you're talking about G-Unit's image of untouchable toughness. Alright gang, let me tell you about Domination before we get into exactly what he said on Cam Capone's show, because context matters here, and I need y'all to understand who this person is on a real level. Domination, real name Donald Coleman, is a rapper who used to run in G-Unit circles back in the day. Most known for his association and collaborations with Bang M Smurf, who was himself a former G-Unit affiliate with his own wild reputation in the streets. So this is not some random person on the street who claims to have seen something. This is someone who was embedded in that world, moving in those same circles, knowing the people, knowing the codes, and knowing the streets like the back of his hand. He wasn't an outsider throwing shade. He was right there in the mix during those formative years. And what Domination told the Cam Capone News Show on May 23rd, 2025, this just dropped and shook the internet. What he said was explosive. The kind of on-camera revelation that has everybody in the comments going crazy with debates about truth, loyalty, and legacy. But before he got to the dice game stuff, he says something else first that set the whole tone of the conversation. And I want y'all to really pay attention to this part, because it adds so much weight. When the interview started and they were talking about how Domination and Toney Yayo know each other, Dom was very clear. He said he's known Toney since he was a kid, that they met on the block, that they came up in the same environment, crossing paths on those same unforgiving streets in New York we've been talking about this whole time. But here's where it gets wild and revealing. The host started referring to Yayo as Dom's big homie, meaning someone he looked up to, someone above him in the street hierarchy, with that automatic respect. And Domination shut that down immediately. No hesitation. He said he never looked up to Yayo in his life, that he wasn't much to look up to. that he was just an ordinary hustler on the block like everybody else trying to eat. Oh my God, y'all. That's a loud statement when you really sit with it, coming from someone who was there, who saw Yayo in his element before the fame, before the G-Unit deal, before the platinum plaques and the global tours. He's basically saying on block, before all of that shine, Toney Yayo wasn't some untouchable, feared figure commanding the scene. He was just another dude out there grinding, nothing more, nothing less. And that sets up everything that comes next perfectly, painting a picture of the gap between the block reality and the rap superstar image that G-Unit built so masterfully. Because if Domination already saw Yayo as an ordinary person on the block, not someone to be afraid of or put on a pedestal, not someone commanding that automatic respect the way street figures in that era usually did when they had that aura, then what he says about the dice game makes complete sense within that frame and hits even harder. All right, y'all, this is the part of the story you've been waiting for, the moment it all explodes. This is where it gets crazy and the internet loses its mind. Let me break it all the way down without holding back. About 13 minutes into his interview with Cam Capone News, Domination started talking about a specific incident involving Toney Yayo at a dice game, and what he described was not some small thing or minor beef. This was not a little altercation that got exaggerated over time. This was a full-blown street situation that could have ended in tragedy. So get this. Toney was at a dice game. He was rolling dice with somebody in what started as a normal hood vibe, the kind that happens every night in spots like South Jamaica. Normal enough situation, right? We just established that dice games were basically part of everyday culture there. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then it went left, and when it went left, Toney Yayo got smacked. He got hit at a dice game in New York City. This man, who was a member of one of the most powerful rap groups on the planet, a key part of G-Unit, one of the most feared and respected crews in hip-hop history, got smacked like a regular cat in a dispute over dice. But wait, because here's where Domination said it turned into something even bigger and more chaotic. After Yayo got smacked, guns came out, multiple people pulling straps in the heat of the moment. Domination described it as a wild, wild west situation. Straight chaos with everybody on edge, and the potential for bodies to drop right there on the spot. Bro, that's actually crazy when you let it sink in fully, because think about the implications of that story on every level. This wasn't some beef that built over time with diss tracks or subliminals. This wasn't a planned confrontation or industry drama. This was a dice game, the kind of situation Toney Yayo himself has said he was around constantly growing up, and it spiraled completely out of control in a way that exposed vulnerabilities nobody wants on their record. And the person telling the story wasn't some random internet commenter chasing views. It was someone who was there, someone who came from the same block, who moved in the same world, who was literally present in those streets during that era and had no reason to fabricate details for no gain. Y'all seeing this, chat? Are we surprised by any of this when you zoom out and look at the full picture of street life versus the polished rap persona? Now, some people online have pushed back on this story hard, saying Domination is reaching, that he's just looking for attention or trying to relive old glory days by dropping names. There are folks claiming the interviewer was fishing for drama that wasn't really there, stirring the pot for clicks in a world where hip-hop beef content gets millions of views overnight. And that's a fair conversation to have, because not everyone who makes a claim in an interview is being completely truthful. The hip-hop interview world is full of people who exaggerate, misremember, or straight up lie for a moment of shine, a quick boost to their own relevance. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't happen all the time, especially when bigger names are involved and the internet is ready to amplify anything spicy. But here's the thing that makes this different and worth taking seriously. Domination wasn't saying this happened to him personally in a way that made him the hero. He was saying he witnessed it as a bystander who was present when it went down, giving specifics that feel textured and real. The details he gave, the specificity of it, the way he described the guns coming out and calling it a Wild West situation, that's not the kind of vague story someone tells when they're just making things up on the spot. Vague stories don't have that kind of raw texture, that lived-in feel that comes from actually being embedded in the culture. Plus, and this is crucial for why the story spread like wildfire, the broader internet reaction to this story wasn't really disbelief or mass denial. Most people in the comments, on the forums, in the spaces where hip-hop culture gets discussed daily, the reaction was more like this tracks, or it feels consistent with what people already knew or suspected about that era in those streets. It fit the narrative of the early 2000s Queens grind without feeling forced or out of character for the environment Yayo himself has described in past interviews. So now, let me address the elephant in the room that everybody's probably thinking about right now as this story circulates. Has Toney Yayo said anything about this? Has he responded directly? Has he addressed the story that Domination put out there on Cam Capone's show with any kind of clapback or explanation? And here's where it gets interesting and leaves room for all kinds of speculation. Because as of right now, Toney Yayo has not publicly addressed Domination's specific claims from this interview. No response on social media, no interview clapback, no IG stories or tweets shutting it down. Nothing direct at all. Now, that could mean a number of things, and let me break it down for y'all in detail, because silence in hip-hop speaks volumes sometimes. Option 1, Yayo doesn't feel like it's worth responding to at this stage in his career. In the world of street credibility and hip-hop reputation management, sometimes the worst thing you can do is respond to every single person who says something about you, especially from the past. Responding to domination gives the story more oxygen, more views, more traction. It validates it in a way by acknowledging it exists. It tells the internet, this touched me enough to respond. And sometimes silence is the ultimate power move, letting the noise fade while you stay focused on the present. Option 2, and this is the one that a lot of people are sitting with in the comments and group chats. Maybe Toney Yayo's silence isn't because the story isn't true, or because he doesn't care. Maybe it's because responding would require him to go on record addressing something from a time and a place that he'd rather leave exactly where it is. In the past, buried under the success and the G-Unit legacy. Because here's the thing, gang. Toney Yayo has spoken openly about the chaos of those streets in his own words multiple times. He's talked about gunfire in dice games. We literally just covered the story he told about the barbershop situation where things popped off. He has never tried to pretend he came from a peaceful, calm environment or sugarcoated what South Jamaica, Queens was like. He's been real about the violence, the hustle, the survival mode that defined his early life. So if something like what Domination described did happen, a dice game going sideways, things escalating to smacks and guns, that's not something that would be out of place in the world Yayo has described living in. What it would be is embarrassing on a personal level. And specifically embarrassing in a very particular way because the image that 50 Cent built, that G-Unit built from the jump, was one of strength, of toughness, of not being the kind of people you could move on without serious consequences. The whole brand was built on that we, not the ones energy, that street authenticity that made them legends. So if there's a story floating around that one of the members got smacked at a dice game, even before the fame, even when they were just regular kids from the block, figuring it out, that's the kind of thing that chips away at an image no matter how much time has passed. Even if nobody really believes it changes who he is deep down, the story still exists now, out in the open, set on camera, on a platform that gets millions of views and lives forever on YouTube. What's also worth noting is that Toney Yayo himself has been very open in interviews about the idea that the street life image is complicated and performative at times. He's talked about the fact that being a rapper means you're always performing a version of yourself, that the lifestyle comes with constant pressure to maintain an image for the fans, the streets, and the industry. He said himself that you never have your peace, that you're always watching your back, always managing perception like it's a full-time job. On top of the music, so maybe, just maybe, a story like the one Domination told hits harder for Yayo not just because of the incident itself, but because of what it represents on a bigger scale. The idea that someone from his own world, someone who knew him before the fame and the deals, is out here on camera saying that in those streets, he wasn't feared or commanding the scene. He was just an ordinary dude doing what everybody was doing to survive. That's the real story. Underneath the story, y'all, the human side that fame tries to bury, but the block always remembers. So let me zoom out for a second, gang, because I want to give y'all the full picture here and expand on why this matters beyond one interview clip. Because this isn't just about a smack at a dice game or some old hood story resurfacing. This is about something bigger, something that's at the heart of hip-hop culture for decades now. This is about the gap between image and reality. And that gap is something that exists in hip-hop at a level that most people don't fully examine or talk about openly. Toney Yayo built a career alongside 50 Cent and Lloyd Banks on the foundation of authenticity, or at least the perception of it. G-Unit's entire appeal was that these were real dudes from real streets who lived real lives before the music blew up and changed everything. 50 Cent literally got shot 9 times and survived, got dropped by Columbia Records after Eminem heard a demo and saw the potential, then hustled his way to the top against every odd imaginable with that relentless drive. That authenticity was the engine that drove all of them, and Yayo was part of that machine, riding the wave even when he was behind bars. The Free Yayo campaign worked not just because 50 was promoting it relentlessly. It worked because people believed Yayo was a real one who was doing real time while his crew went platinum without him, adding that underdog layer that made the story even more powerful and relatable. But the streets, the actual streets, not the romanticized version we see in videos and lyrics, are complicated. They don't care about your image, your platinum plaques, your sneaker deals, or your podcast numbers. On the block, what matters is what's happening right now in real time in front of people who actually know you from back when. And Domination's story, true or not, is a reminder that the block has its own memory, its own receipts, and its own way of keeping it real long after the cameras stop rolling. And the money starts flowing. Y'all think about this on a deeper level. Domination said they met on the block, knew each other as kids running the same circles. The way he talked about Yayo was the way people talk about someone they grew up around but never put on a pedestal or mythologized. He was just an ordinary hustler, not a kingpin, not someone who struck fear just by walking in the room. Just a regular dude doing what everybody was doing to make it through another day. Now, I want to be clear about something here, gang, and I want to say this directly so nobody misunderstands me or takes it the wrong way. Being an ordinary hustler on the block is not a disrespect on its own. Most people who grew up in neighborhoods like South Jamaica, Queens in the 1980s and 90s were just trying to survive the best way they knew how. Being ordinary in that environment just means you were human. It means you weren't superhuman or some invincible figure from the movies. It means you were a person with flaws, fears, and moments where things didn't go your way. The problem is when the image you project, the persona you build for public consumption through music, interviews, and the brand, is dramatically different from that reality on the ground. That's when stories like Dominations land hard and spark all this conversation. Not because being ordinary is shameful, far from it, but because the contrast between ordinary and the larger-than-life image creates a kind of friction that the internet absolutely feasts on, turning it into endless debates, memes, and think pieces. And this is something every rapper from a street background has to navigate for their entire career, the tension between who you were before the fame, who you are now, and who your brand says you are, to sell records and maintain relevance. It never fully goes away, no matter how many years pass or how much money you stack. There will always be someone who knew you before, who was there in the trenches, who remembers the unfiltered version and isn't afraid to speak on it when the moment comes. And in the age of YouTube channels like Cam Capone News and all these interview platforms that exist specifically to pull these stories out of people from the past, the chances of those stories never seeing the light of day are basically zero. That's the world Toney Yayo is living in right now, decades later. And that's the world that Domination just dropped a bomb into, with one candid conversation that has the whole culture talking. Now, let's talk about where Toney Yayo is at right now, because I don't want this to be all about dragging the man or focusing only on the negative. That's not what this is about at all. Let's give the full picture so y'all get the complete context of his journey and current place in the game. As of right now, in 2025, turning into 2026, Toney Yayo is still active, still in the culture, still moving around and contributing in ways that keep him relevant, even if the solo rap career isn't at the peak it once was. He co-hosts a podcast called The Real Report alongside Uncle Murder, which has been doing really well in carving out its own lane in the hip-hop media space. He's been open and honest and entertaining on that platform, talking about the industry shifts, current events, and hip-hop. Giving his perspective as someone who's been in the game for over 2 decades and seen it all, the highs of the G-Unit explosion, the lows of legal troubles, the evolution of streaming and social media changing how artists connect with fans. It's the kind of no-filter conversation that fans love, because it feels authentic coming from a guy who lived the street-to-stage pipeline. Earlier this month, he even announced that the G-Unit Reebok sneakers are coming back. Said on The Real Report, "We got some big news. The G-Unit sneakers are coming back, sparking nostalgia and excitement among fans who remember those classic collabs from the mid-2000s. So there's still money and movement happening around the G-Unit brand, still that legacy energy keeping the name alive in fashion, music, and conversation. And honestly, that's kind of the interesting thing about Toney Yayo's legacy when you step back and look at it holistically. Despite all the things that have been said about him over the years, the comparisons to Lloyd Banks and 50 Cent in terms of rap skills, the legal situations that tested his resolve, the controversies that pop up from time to time, the man is still here. Still relevant enough that a story dropping about him on Cam Capone News sends the internet into a frenzy with millions of views and endless threads. Still important enough that Domination thought his name alone was worth dropping in an interview to create a moment and get people talking. That's something, y'all. Love him or hate him, Toney Yayo still moves the needle in hip-hop conversations. Still carries that G-Unit weight that means something to the culture, even this far removed from the peak years. But here's what I'll say, and this is my honest read on the situation. After sitting with all the details and the context, the Dice Game story from Domination is out there now. It's been covered by major outlets, it's all over YouTube with reaction videos and breakdowns. It's everywhere from Twitter Spaces to Reddit threads dissecting every word. The question of whether Yayo responds at some point is still open. And if he does respond, if he ever addresses this directly in an interview or on his podcast, that's going to be a whole other conversation worth having. Because the response matters more than the claim sometimes. The way you handle being put on blast like this tells you everything about a person's character and where their head is at after all these years. You can deny it outright, which is the easy move and what a lot of people expect in these situations. You can flip it and say it never happened, which may or may not be true depending on the facts. Or, and this is the most interesting option that could actually flip the script in his favor, You can own the block completely. You can say, yeah, dice games go sideways in the hood. I've been in situations like that growing up. This is the life we came from, and it wasn't pretty. That kind of response, the honest, unflinching, this is what the streets look like energy, would actually be the most powerful thing Yayo could do, because it humanizes him without diminishing the grind. Because if there's one thing his career has taught us through all the ups and downs, is that the truth, even when it's uncomfortable or messy, tends to resonate more with the real fans than a carefully managed image that feels too polished for the origins. And that right there, gang, is the full story when you put it all together. From Marvin Bernard dropping out of school at 15 on the unforgiving streets of South Jamaica, Queens, to running with 50 Cent and Lloyd Banks and building G-Unit from the ground up mixtape by mixtape, to sitting in jail while his crew went platinum without him and watching from behind bars as the world embraced their sound, to becoming a certified part of hip-hop history with albums, tours, and a brand that still echoes today. And now, decades later, having the former associate go on camera and drop a story about a dice game that's got the internet talking and debating street cred all over again. That's the life of Toney Yayo in 2025 and 2026. And it is never boring, never predictable, always layered with that raw Queens energy that made G-Unit what it was. To add even more depth to why this whole narrative resonates so strongly, let's talk about the broader culture of dice games in hip-hop and street life, because it's bigger than one incident or one interview. Dice games, or street craps as it's often called, have been a staple in urban communities for generations, going back way before Yayo's time in the 80s and 90s. It's not just gambling, it's a social ritual, a way for brothers to bond, test luck, settle scores, or just pass time in neighborhoods where options for recreation were limited by poverty and systemic issues. In places like South Jamaica, you'd see games popping off in parks, hallways, or after-hours spots with stacks of cash on the ground, rules enforced by reputation, and tensions rising with every roll of the dice. Yayo's own stories, like the barbershop one, highlight how quickly it can flip from laughs to lead when money, pride, and egos collide. Think about it. In an environment where respect is currency and disrespect can get you marked, refusing a walk isn't just about the cash. It's about power dynamics, about not showing weakness in front of the block. That's why these situations escalate to guns so often. It's not random violence. It's the code of the streets playing out in real time. Compare that to other hip-hop tragedies or near misses, like the Takeoff situation in Houston that Yayo referenced, or even older stories from the 90s crack era where gambling spots turned into crime scenes overnight. It shows how the same patterns repeat across generations, from the old school to the new wave, because the underlying pressures of the hood don't change just because the music evolves or the money gets bigger. Artists like Yayo carry that baggage into fame, and when old associates like Domination pull back the curtain, it forces everyone to confront the reality that the from the block narrative isn't always glamorous. It's gritty, imperfect, and human. Diving deeper into G-Unit's early days for context, those mixtape years before the major deal were pure grind, the kind that built unbreakable bonds but also tested them. Yayo, 50, and Banks were dropping tapes like 50 Cent is the Future and No Mercy, No Fear, flooding the streets with that raw, unfiltered Queen sound that mixed street tales with club bang. They were battling other crews, dodging industry politics, and staying loyal when labels came calling only for 50. That period forged the "we run this" mentality that defined their peak, but it also meant carrying the weight of past beefs and block reputations into the spotlight. Yayo's jail stint amplified that. Missing the get-rich-or-die try-and wave must have been torture, hearing Many Men or 21 Questions blow up while locked down, but it also made his return that much more triumphant when Thoughts of a Predicate Felon hit. The album wasn't just music. It was a statement of resilience, with tracks like G-Unit Anthem and collabs that reminded everybody why the crew was special. Fast forward to today, and G-Unit's influence is still felt in everything from modern drill to fashion revivals like those Reebok sneakers. The brand lives on through reunions, podcasts, and that enduring loyalty 50 showed back then. Yet stories like Dominations remind us that no legacy is bulletproof. The block keeps its own score, and in the social media era, old memories get new life fast. On the image versus reality tip, hip-hop has always wrestled with this tension. From Tupac's thug poet persona to Jay-Z evolving from Marcy Projects to billionaire mogul. For G-Unit, it was amplified because their brand was so tied to unapologetic street toughness. The bulletproof vests and videos, the disses aimed at anyone who tested them, the narrative of rising from the ashes after 50's shooting. Yayo embodied that as the enforcer type in the group, but Domination's ordinary hustler description peels back the layers to show the human underneath. It's not a takedown, It's a reminder that authenticity cuts both ways. Fans love the realness, but when it includes vulnerability like getting smacked in a dice game, it challenges the invincible aura. Psychologically, maintaining that image takes a toll. Constant vigilance, the pressure to never show weakness, the fear that one story could shift public perception. Yayo's podcast openness suggests he's evolved, talking industry without the old guard bravado, which is growth. If he addresses this, owning it could strengthen his legacy, showing he's above the fray and secure in who he is now. Fan reactions online have been split. Some defend Yayo as a product of his environment, others joke about it in memes, but most agree it adds texture to the G-Unit myth without erasing the accomplishments. In wrapping this all up with even more perspective, the power of platforms like Cam Capone News can't be overstated. These long-form interviews give voice to the affiliates, the OGs, the ones who were there but never got the shine, and in doing so, they keep hip-hop's oral history alive. Domination's tie to Bang-Am Smurf adds credibility in street circles, as Smurf had his own documented run-ins and G-Unit connections that made waves back in the day. It's not clout chasing when the details align with the known history of Queens in that era. The poverty-driving hustles, the drugs-fueling tensions, the dice is both escape and trap. Yayo's story expanded across his life, shows resilience from dropout to platinum artist, jail to podcast host, block to brand revival. The sneakers coming back symbolize that G-Unit never fully faded. It's cyclical like the streets themselves. Whether Domination's account is 100% accurate or colored by time and perspective, it sparks necessary conversations about accountability, growth, and what it means to leave the block behind while honoring where you came from. Hip-hop thrives on these narratives because they're real, messy, triumphant, contradictory. So y'all tell me something in the comments or wherever you're watching this unfold. Do you think Toney Yayo responds to this eventually, maybe on The Real Report or in a sit-down? Do you think Domination is telling the truth from his vantage point, or do you think this is just someone trying to get their 15 minutes off a bigger name that's still relevant? Drop it below because I genuinely want to know what y'all think. After all this breakdown. And yo, if you learned something new today, if this gave you a different look at the G-Unit story and what life was really like in those streets before the cameras, the platinum and the global fame turned it into legend, you gotta hit that like button and make sure you subscribe so you never miss a video like this that goes this deep. If you want more content like this, deep dives into hip-hop stories, the real behind the scenes, the block before the fame, the image versus the reality checks that keep it honest, we got a whole lot more coming your way. The next one is going to go just as hard, maybe even harder, trust me on that. I'll catch y'all in the next one. Peace.